Oi, budge!
Over the next while, 30, 50, 100 years, it's going to affect Bangkok, it's going to affect London, it's going to affect Sydney.
We are now seeing bushfires all over Australia, Greece, the US. We are seeing right across New Zealand, cyclones, flooding across Australia. Well, we are now feeling and seeing it more and more. And is it now that we're touching and feeling it that we're finally going, oh, this is real?
If everyone's going to electric vehicles, then they get that electricity from a coal-fired power plant, which loses 60% of the energy it produces through cooling towers. And so it's kind of ironic.
In this episode of Budge, How to Fudge Being Human, we talk climate change, the environment and human capability to accept and adapt with a good friend of Budge and climate change expert Ben Baden. With so much misinformation out there around climate change, how do we get humans to accept the science and make the urgent changes we need to ensure that we can call this place home for a long time to come? We hope you love the podcast and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or any of your favourite podcast platforms. Welcome to Budge, How to Fudge Being Human, the podcast that helps you figure out how to be better at being human. What do Greta Thunberg fans and Donald Trump fans have in common? They're both screwed by climate change, irrespective if they believe in it or not. Today we'll be talking about that and the impact on humans with, as always, Dr. Darren Coppy, my good mate and co-host, behavioural scientist.
Each time you say "as always," the "always" is like a disappointing.
It is. There's a behavioural science around that.
You hate me.
As always, Dr. Darren Coppy. And we're delighted to have here another good mate of ours, Ben Baden, who we both know through the vocational education sector, but actually now works in climate change, work with a whole range of companies supporting them as this world changes. Welcome, mate. Thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, that's my pleasure. Apart from Darren. Yeah.
as always, Darren's here. It's awkward because it's his house.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Difficult to escape.
Yeah. Thanks, mate, for joining us. I guess to kick off, we both know you through the employment services sector and vocational education and training. But you now do a lot of work in climate change. Why the move, mate? Why the change?
Well, it's not been a change. I've run the things in parallel for about the last 15 years. And I set up my consulting business to do strategic planning with agencies. And of course, different organisations have to deal with the impacts of climate change on their business. And there have been, remarkable changes in the last 5 years in particular. As part of their risk assessment and risk analysis of the big mega trends that are going to affect their business over the medium and longer term. And more recently, it's become sort of very prescient that impacts are being felt year by year. So progressive companies need to have a lens on climate change and how the policy environment is going to adapt to make the changes that we all need to make.
And we're going to talk in depth about the impact on business and humans as we go, some of the changes we have to make and talk around concepts such as managed retreat. But before that, let's get over this argument of if climate change is real. It's real. But I'd love to understand, Dr. Darren, why do we still have this problem that some people will not accept the science of it?
Well, there's always going to be 2%, I think it is, the last thing. 98% of papers and academics are saying it's real. You'd probably get 2% of priests that don't believe in God.
Yeah.
So, but the reason is that
I feel they might be in the wrong profession,
or have the wrong motivations.
But there's look, humans are great at hope. It's a strength. So we're always hoping that it's not real. But it's also that thing, that present bias, where unless we can feel it, touch it, and immediately be impacted by it. Then we don't necessarily believe in it. However, that's why there seems to be more of a change in the last 5 years in particular, is that it is impacting people directly.
And is that the change? So the change in views towards it isn't necessarily then that there's this belief in science or we won the argument. It's the fact, I guess both of you, that we are now seeing bushfires all over Australia, Greece, the US. I think there were forest fires in the UK, I think, last year. We are seeing right across New Zealand, cyclones, flooding across Australia. Well, we are now feeling and seeing it more and more. And is it now that we're touching and feeling it that we're finally going, oh, this is real.
Yeah, I think my observation is that the lived experience over the last few years has been a game changer. When you think about the 2019 fires and you think about, it was an area about the size of the UK, BUDGE, and we were affected out here in central western New South Wales with weeks and weeks of smoke and fires, and you had to move your stuff into a safe place. So the lived experience over the last 5 years in particular has not so much changed people's minds, but it's certainly changed their voting intentions as it got up the prioritised list of things that people were worrying about. And the research is that about 65%, 64 or 65% of people believe they will be directly harmed by climate change in Australia in their lifetime.
So we're talking about the elections, of course, there, mention of Australia in terms of the elections. And we are, of course, recording this in Australia. We are out every Tuesday, 7 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. Please like and subscribe down below on YouTube or connect with us in our Facebook group. So we are now finally seeing then people starting to believe in this. Aside from that lived experience, is there any reason, I suppose, behaviourally that we start to believe this, Darren?
No. End of my contribution.
Yeah, well, it's probably your best so far, mate. Cut our losses.
But there is something. So people think Americans don't believe in climate change. Well, that's not necessarily the case. It might be some politicians, and vociferous ones don't. But Yale, they kill me at Harvard and Yale for saying that. But Yale did a survey, and they found that 51% of Americans, it's not that they don't believe in it, they feel helpless and hopeless in trying to address anything to do with climate change. And I think that's one of the biggest issues is what is it I can do as an individual to make any sort of difference? And the news about the climate is invariably desperate and catastrophic potentially. And that actually makes people helpless. And we know that most, in fact, all animal species that they've experimented on, if you make them feel helpless, they become inactive. And that's the problem. Humans have become inactive in this because they feel helpless. So if you've got 51% of Americans feeling that it's hopeless to address climate change, then they curl up, conserve energy and give up.
And is there anything we could do to change that?
Yeah, you can change it by broadcasting the successes, the things that we are doing well. And it's about building agency and self-efficacy again. It's a thing that you think that you can control and improve the future. You're having an impact. The things that you're doing, the recycling, the ozone layers got smaller because we moved away from CFCs or whatever. We can address it and we need to do more of what we're doing. And you're making an impact. And that will accelerate people's activity and action if they feel that there's a point to it all. It's not pointless.
And the great irony in all this, I suppose, is that we finally now believe it because we're experiencing it. The threats of the last 20, 30, 40 years of the fact that we're going to have floods and fires and what may come is we're now experiencing it. And that's been the thing that's actually made us finally believe it. Do you feel confident now, Ben, that we're at a point where by utilising that, we can actually start to make the changes we need?
What I'd say so far is that the answer is no. We haven't made the changes that we need to make so far, and the primary metric on that is the parts per million of carbon dioxide and the equivalent gases in the oxygen in the atmosphere, which has steadily increased, and the rate of increase has become steeper. So
what are we looking at, mate? Is there a point in time where if we don't fix this, we truly will never turn it around?
Yeah, we're pretty close to that point, I think. Yeah. And so when you have a look at the climate scientists, a lot of them are sort of dropping their heads. It's like, well, we've been screaming at you for 30 years to try and do something about this. And we had a window, and the window is really closing. And 420 parts per million, what used to be the point that people would say, well, that's about where irreversible tipping points are going to occur. We're there now. When I was born, it was 317 parts per million. Before the Industrial Revolution, it was 280 parts per million. So the background level was through the Holocene period was, we had 10,000 years of a self-balancing climate that supported the type of growth of humanity that we've seen. And so, have we reached a critical threshold in terms of people's attitudes to want to make changes? Possibly. When you have a look at people's willingness to take personal responsibility, the Pew Research Center does this internationally.
Which I believe is in Washington.
It is, and so it shows that 79% of people in Australia are prepared to take action. So, actually, the way that we frame it is really important. The evidence seems to be that populations are well ahead of their respective governments on this.
How drastic, though, does that level of change have to be? I assume we're reaching that point now where we have to make changes to our lifestyles, which is so drastic that then leads me to a question in a minute for Darren, which is, can humans even do this?
It can be done, and when you have a look at the sorts of things that are making a difference in other countries, because Australia, where we're broadcasting from, has been very slow, and it's been a very highly contested space. But
that's an interesting point, isn't it? It's only when you go overseas from Australia you remember how the rest of the world isn't actually thinking like us on a number of things, but particularly climate change.
Yeah, well, I mean, Margaret Thatcher was a very conservative politician, but she was also a scientist, and she promulgated the climate science way back in the early 80s. And so,
ironically, is Thatcher someone that can give us hope? As a Liverpool fan, I can't believe I've just said that, but if you look at it, wasn't it Thatcher that effectively phoned up Ronald Reagan one day and said, right, you need to get on board on was it aerosols and CFCs, and that's actually impacted the ozone layer.
Yeah. Well, that led to the Montreal agreement, and that actually saved us. Yeah, I mean, it was a very present threat. We only had a few years left, and there were ready alternatives, and so it was like, okay, well, we can still make money, guys, and so they switched to the alternative.
I saw something on the internet the other day in a comment section about whatever happened to that ozone layer thing, and why people, that was all just nonsense, and no one carries on about that anymore. But my understanding is because we did something about it.
Yeah, well, the hole is still there, and it's just progressively getting smaller. But skin cancers, for example, have tripled or thereabouts, but because of the lack of the protection through the ozone layer. So we acted just about in time, and so possibly that's the learning that we can take from the dealing with aerosols. But when you have a look at what governments who want to do something are doing, it really falls into four categories. And the first is that they actually provide substitutes for fossil fuels, a lot of solar on roofs, a lot of large-scale solar, wind, batteries, pumped hydro, those sorts of things. Then there's a whole suite of policies that you can do to reduce emissions in other ways. And that, there are myriad examples, but a lot of it lives in the sort of waste stream, stopping the waste stream, looking at where emissions occur, and trying to design out those things. Some of it is substituting to get people using public transport. There's just a lot less,
which causes a huge problem in Australia because the size of the country, but.
Yeah, that's right. So there are changes that need to be made, but a lot of it can be part of the way that urban centres and country towns design their growth strategy around being, a 10-minute city is what Port Macquarie describes itself as, and most cities are aspiring to have services and so forth within 15 minutes of where people live. So cycling, walking, and taking public transport becomes a real possibility. But, the other areas that governments that want to do stuff are doing is to mitigate or adapt the direct impacts of global heating. So better insulation for houses, better building standards, those sorts of things. And then fourthly, the things that they do is they get on the bandwagon with the global movement and align themselves to this. And increasingly, you can see from mechanisms, carbon adjustment mechanisms are being put in place. You can't dodge it any longer, and nor should we be able to. But progressive governments are the ones that are driving global action because it's a global issue, right?
So. Absolutely. Darren, are humans capable of making the level of change that we need to make?
Yeah, but there's that immediacy thing. So when it's staring us in the face, when there's immediate impacts, which there have been more of, then we'll kick into gear. But and a lot of people think that look, when it gets really bad, our governments, our budgets, our science will come in and fix it. But one of the points Ben made was, well, the trouble is there's a lag behind the tipping point and the impact beyond which you can do nothing. It's like when you brake going really fast, you've got 100 feet of skidding that you're not in control of before the crash. And it's whether we're in a point where we can brake or whether we're in that skid. And the thing is, it's intangible. So that's the problem we've got. A lot of us hope when the shit hits the fan, we'll be able to pull out, like we did with COVID, we'll all be able to group together and science and governments and budgets will be able to fix this for us. But it might be too late by then.
So that brings us back to Ben's point about progressive governments, right? So say there is a will. What do we do about the nations that have no interest in this? And I suppose Australia was at one point the pariah.
Yeah, that's right. Both rich and a big emitter per capita, one of the biggest in the world. And because we make money out of fossil fuel interests, we didn't want to make a change, and so we tried to find any excuse to say, oh well, we don't burn it here, so it's not our problem.
Yeah, it's a great point. 2/3 of Australia's emissions are actually in other countries because we've sent the coal overseas for them to burn.
So there's an easy fix then for us on that one, really.
Well, we need the money, so
yeah.
Well, I mean, do we? I mean, when you price carbon pollution as an externality, where you don't put a price on it, where it can be done for free, it can be done somewhere else, and you ignore your responsibility there, you end up paying billions and billions to deal with the consequences of it. You have a look at New Zealand at the moment and the reconstruction that's going to be required after Cyclone Gabrielle last weekend. The actual costs of dealing with this thing is enormous. And in fact, one of the things from that was published last week by Chatham House in London was they were saying.
Are we allowed to discuss that?
No, not outside of you.
Yeah, I'll tell you the key points, and that's what it was. No, they talked about a doom spiral, which is you're dealing with the effects of climate change so much that you don't have the budget or the will to be able to deal with the underlying causes, and that really. So, you've got a virtuous circle for those progressive companies, progressive governments that are getting on board and doing stuff. And individuals want to do it, but that individual action alone cannot change the building regulations. It cannot change the big picture policies that need to change, cannot change the approval of mines and fossil fuel interests. And, so you have to say, well, why is it that governments are lagging behind the views of their population? And it's really about how power works in the political system. Who has power and how can they affect the policy settings?
Yeah, I love this Overton principle where politicians will only deal with things that they think, a very small amount of things that they think won't affect them. And it really takes public perception and business perception to change before government's willing to change. I have come up with a solution that listening to you. I mean, it's heartbreaking what's happening to New Zealand. They've not only had, the climate change stuff, the floods, the cyclones, but of course now previously earthquakes. We just need to tell Australians it's going to end up with more Kiwis living in Australia, and we'd probably be helping them as well as ourselves.
But there is a lot of positives out of Australia. If we need to promote the positives for people to be activated, isn't there 2,500 new solar farms planned, 5,000 more wind turbine farms, but one of the issues I used to have was that if everyone's going to electric vehicles, then they get that electricity from a coal-fired power plant, which loses 60% of the energy it produces through the cooling towers. And so it's kind of ironic. But then what allayed my fears that these, the energy and the amount of money that goes into mining lithium to store it and also generate and build wind turbines is inefficient. But then it turns out that most of these things, when you fit a massive solar farm and a massive wind turbine farm, they fix the prices for the next 20 years. So even though it's a big initial cost, the return as the years go by is much, much bigger. And with that, Australia is producing enough to replace the carbon-based fuels and power that we've got. So we've got the things in place. We've got the technology now.
Yeah, we certainly have the technology, and increasingly we've got the will, because you can make money over the long term by having energy that's free, distributed a slightly different way. So you've got a few things there, Darren. One is, about the inevitable transition to renewables to power the grid. By about 2030, I think in New South Wales, we will have done a really massive shift from, 20% of renewable energy in 2020, thereabouts, 23% or something, to round about 85 to 90%. And so those concerns about, we're running our transport system, the electrification of everything goes back to coal-fired power stations. That is the transition that's underway right now. And of course, we're blessed in Australia with wind and solar resources, which a lot of countries would love to have,
including our homeland.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, that is an issue, isn't it? Is to survive or to transfer to those. If you are in Northern Europe, Russia, the cold areas of China and North America, you need the storage of energy. And isn't that the inhibitive technology that's still missing a little bit?
No, not at all. I mean, technically feasible with large batteries, but some of the batteries are pumped hydro, where you pump water up a hill with the renewable energy when it's generated, and then you draw it down through turbines, like the Snowy Hydro scheme. You draw it down, and you actually don't need too many pumped hydro schemes to provide grid level security. In New South Wales, maybe 6 or 8 large pumped hydro schemes around some of the really large dams that exist now. That would do it. So that technology is well understood. You need to change the transmission lines. You need to make the system more resilient and to plug it into where you're going to locate those things. So it's not simple, but it's technically feasible. It's within.
Well, in a way, it's weirdly simple. You're just pumping up water when you've got the energy when it's sunny, and then when it's dark or at night time or at peak times, you let the water run back down again and run the turbines to power it up. It's a weirdly simple methodology, although it's probably very technical to do it. And of course, there are other positives, Ben, in that we've got more polar bear skins that we can use to keep cosy.
I wondered why you were putting this mock polar bear skin at my back.
Oh, it's mock, is it?
Yeah.
Yes.
We kind of, this is such a huge subject, and we can talk about some of the scientists for a while, but I want to talk about the human side. We talked a little about denialists, but let's talk about the impact on humans that might come if we don't fix this. And even if we do try and fix it, what's going to happen anyway? You introduced me to a phrase, Ben, that I'd never heard before.
Was it thank you? I've never heard you say that.
Not from you. Managed retreat.
Yeah.
Mate, what is managed retreat? Because this for me is the one thing at best we can hope for in if we don't fix this.
Well, managed retreat is underway in Lismore at the moment, and parts of Brisbane. And
I might just explain that. Lismore is we're in New South Wales, which is obviously the biggest state in Australia. I live in Queensland, the best state in Australia. But Sydney, of course, is in New South Wales. And right in the northern part of New South Wales is a little town called Lismore, probably 50, 60,000 people, which has experienced such profound flooding in the last few years. And I'll let you probably take it from there.
Yeah, so the flooding events have just got worse and worse. It's on the confluence of 3 rivers, I think. And so when you get a major event, as we had, last year. It's flooding to much higher levels than ever before. And
I was just going to say, though, the thing that human and humanity-wise that seems to have impacted people, having spoken to a few from that area, that moving out has been renewing their house insurance.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Oh, was that a point that you were going to make?
No, it's because I'm tapping the table, and people at home love this. No, it's the heartbeat of the podcast. This but because some people's house insurance has gone up tenfold, and they're thinking, well, that's it. I've got to move out now. That is the tipping point. Because humans always say, oh, the volcano ran through the place, or this happened. We will rebuild. And it's like, don't
rebuild. That's a bad idea.
Sorry.
And so the managed nature of that is to say that there are some areas around rivers and floodplains which we should never have built in the first place.
Have you two ever been to Lismore?
Yeah.
Have you been to? Have you seen where the river is when it's not flooding?
Yeah, it's way down, isn't it?
And the idea of that thing, it's actually hard to picture. I don't know what the meters are. I think it's over 20 meters. You've got this river running down the back of the CBD, the centre of town, and you sort of look down at it. And when you're not there, I've never been there in a flood, thankfully, but you look at it and you go, how does this thing actually flood this
You're still
town?
talking about the river, but you're looking down on something. You think, how can that get so big?
Yeah.
So for somewhere like Lismore, then, what do we do? These people that live there, they shouldn't rebuild, and that's going to be true of places in New Zealand. We saw that, of course. I know it's climate change and earthquakes are very different things, but we saw that with the earthquakes where they're not rebuilding parts of Christchurch. Is that now the answer, that we have to start? We have to prepare businesses and we have to create an industry which is going to move massive parts of our population?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's really an interim measure, and it's a desperate measure, and it's highly disruptive to the people who live there. But as Darren was saying, a lot of this is driven by the commercial realities of not being able to get insurance and knowing that and you can't get insurance because there's going to be another flood coming through. And it's the rapidity of those things in La Nina years, the wet years, which are being exacerbated by much warmer sea surface temperatures, which create atmospheric rivers. And so you're getting these, New Zealand just had, over 3 weeks, it broke its own records twice for the maximum number of millimeters of rain in a day. And in Lismore, it was 600 millimeters, that's...
And this just flooded the highest level on record in 200-300 years.
Yeah.
Did you see the mayor of Auckland, where he had to justify his message on WhatsApp to his mates that he wasn't going to be able to make it to golf? He's got to deal with these media people. Did you guys not pick up?
No.
Oh, it's brilliant. If you get the chance, go and watch it. Where he's basically back.
Is he still in?
He's still in his job. I don't know how he kept his job.
Well, he won't after this.
He was annoyed he couldn't go play golf or tennis or something or other because he had to go and deal with the media because of all these floods.
Yeah.
So Ben, we're talking about Auckland and we're talking about Lismore. Lismore's a small town in northern New South Wales. Auckland's, and it's not a world major capital. It's a nice capital, obviously. Where else could this potentially affect?
Well, over the next while, 30, 50, 100 years, it's going to affect Bangkok, it's going to affect London, it's going to affect Sydney, it's going to affect communities that are, based around harbours and the sea. And there are billions and billions of people living there. So first of all, people are going to try and build walls.
Well, we literally, most of our major cities were built because they were by a river historically, weren't they? They had to be connected to transport. Yeah. So there's not many places
that will be immune from it. Yeah. And so you can see that the managed retreat is saying, well, after this event, we're not going to build here again, or when you can no longer insure for the risk of these things, you have to move back. But it's not just floods, it's fires as well. And so it's happening on the extremes, pretty much as the climate scientists predicted. It's the extreme events and how you have to change the policy settings to deal with them. And the nature and rapidity of the storms that we face. So It's the storm impacts, one after another after another.
The impact I came across last month in Arizona was the lack of storm impact and the dryness and the lack of rain in a different part of the world. But it was massively impacting the local communities. So there's this lake called Lake Powell on the borders of Arizona. I think it's the second biggest reservoir in the States, and it and the other reservoir sort of provide water for 40 million people, and it's dropped by 72%, and it's the lowest it's been in 1,200 years, 12 centuries that they can make out. And you can see the response to this is that people are building, because we went there because there's all these videos and promotions for water skiing, houseboats, renting boats, fishing, all of these amazing recreational things around this water, where this town called Page sort of lives off of that side of the tourism.
Well, not for long.
None of it's there.
Oh, really?
And there's hundreds and hundreds, millions of dollars worth of houseboats just sat on dry sides above it. The pier to get to the river's gone. They've extended it like 5 meters at a time over and over again. And the most pressing issue is that it's dropped, I think, 60, 70 feet. It only has to go another few feet, and the hydroelectric power it generates for about 5 or 6 million people and loads of businesses in that side of the state. There's no hydroelectric power there, and it's these massive economic impacts that will force change. I think more than perceiving what might happen, or that was a one-off flood, and then it's another one in another 7 years, or another one in another year. It's these, bloody hell, I've got no power.
That would do it.
What am I going to do?
Yeah. And look, the worst case scenario, the best case scenario is that we're wrong, and we end up with these fabulous, better lifestyles that we live. I'm going to wrap up in a second, but I actually wanted to ask you, Ben, what is the best case scenario and what is the worst case scenario? And then maybe Darren, how do humans have to change in order to actually achieve the best case scenario? So, what's the worst thing that can happen now?
Oh, well, you can. The worst case scenario is extremely bad. You have a kind of mass methane burp that drives temperatures rapidly higher.
Well, like out of Siberia.
The permafrost, and that you have a system that's charged, and you very rapidly get to 4 or 5 degrees warming within the next 30, 40 years. That is
and the impact on that on humans.
It's on all life on the planet. It's an accelerated mass extinction event. So that's not to put too fine a point on it. It's sort of press the reset button where we're not part of the mix, and there's a massive biodiversity loss across all species.
That's not necessarily a bad thing for the planet.
Well, actually, I get the sense that you think, well, you bloody deserved it. So
mostly I think parents quite like their children and their grandchildren. But as a species together, where the parents are saying, well, stuff the kids. We can't, my needs now are greater than their needs in the future. And there's an incongruence about that, because I actually think that most people don't think that, but collectively, that seems to be how we're organising ourselves. So, look, the downside is extremely bad. The potential upsides are that we find a better balance, that there's greater equity between this generation and the next, between us and the natural world. What we've talked a lot about emissions in the last little while, but we haven't talked about the biodiversity crisis that is a consequence of that. And we haven't talked about human population. When I was born, there were 3 billion people on the planet.
I said he was old, and he looked.
I am a fresh-faced 60-something. But
are you really 60?
Yeah, but they're
He looks younger than both of us put together.
I lost that bit.
Hang on. But there's now 8 billion people. So that we think that kind of growth, because that's the period that we've lived in, is normal. It's far from normal. We are an infection on the planet, essentially. Yeah. And so
more so than others.
Yeah. And so the upside is that we find a better balance, and that we do value the life support systems that support us, the natural systems that support us, and that we do have a way of sharing the wealth between nations so that we can deal with population through a better sharing of the resources that are available, particularly educational resources.
Yeah, absolutely.
And create a society that's not based on the myth of forever thinking we can grow on a finite planet.
Yeah.
Let's have a return to some sense of the purpose of being here is to continue, not to destroy ourselves. And that's we're Wiradjuri country in New South Wales at the moment, and that was a culture of continuity.
Yeah.
Of
Wiradjuri being the local indigenous.
Yeah, being the local indigenous people, and most indigenous peoples around the world had a way of managing the resources in a way that ensured their continuity, but also the continuity of everything around them. And so that is the sunlit uplands. If we can reach a better paradigm of continuity, then we really will solve a lot of these things. They're all technically feasible to solve.
Yes, which brings me to the human part. If Darren, are humans capable of doing this? What do we need to do to inspire us to get off our butts? And no.
Yes, but the thing is, fear is a great motivator if you feel capable of addressing it. So otherwise it freezes you. And we touched on that earlier on. Education or information does promote change, but barely any. Shame and guilt doesn't promote change, particularly. We know that from your experience. But what does is pride and hope and success. People build on that. And it seems crap, but the point of this isn't ignoring the issues. It's saying we're addressing it, we're succeeding, let's do more of it. And that's proven in everything from business to national movements, that is what engenders more support, more action, and we can address it. So I think we've got to promote what we're doing. We've got the tools to do it. Let's get on and do it. This is where it's worked. And I think more and more and more will happen, and people will get on board, because again, people are believing it, but they don't take action. And in the United States, in Washington, DC, which is a pretty liberal place, they voted for reducing carbon emissions and contributing to or adhering to a carbon tax, something along those lines. 67% of them in a poll said they support it, so they took it to legislation, and it was smashed out because when it came to actually doing it, people didn't. Because
but Darren, is that the difference between the way the political system works and who it's there for? By comparison to what it's the fact that the legislation didn't get up wasn't people not wanting to take personal action on it. It's the way that we've set the political system up and whose interests it serves.
So I suppose my human behavioural thing is about the motivators for action. But what you're saying, and what we've seen, is this disparation, this increasing gap between what the people want to do now and what the political people that are looking after their own jobs want to do, their immediate motivations.
And it's when you get people saying, well, our leaders are not delivering the change that we know we need, that's when you get the changes that we need to see, because individual changes must be part of the mix, but it's the political changes that are actually going to need to do the heavy lifting.
Yeah, again, not nudges, but legislative, financial, fiscal incentive. Yeah.
Well, thank you both of you for joining us, Ben. It's been a real pleasure having you here today. Thank you as always, Dr. Darren Coffin, behavioural scientist. Look, hopefully we are ending on a place of hope that humans do have the capability to make changes, and that we have the chance to make the difference we need to make. If you've enjoyed what we've been listening to today and watching, make sure you check out Budge. Follow us on Facebook. On our Facebook group, it's a lot of fun, and on TikTok and on Instagram. But most of all, watch last week's episode next. Subscribe on YouTube, and watch out for us next Tuesday, 7 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. Thank you for watching, listening. done.
Love you.
Love you.
Well done.
Oi, budge.